Hello and welcome, this is Christopher with Impulse Movement, and today we're going to be installing the Prime Series Emulators into the FZ6 fork assembly. So the first thing we're going to do is remove the top cap off the triple tree. This will allow us to move the handlebars out of the way and access the top caps of our forks. Some top caps will be threaded and some will actually have a C-clip that retains them on top, but that just depends on the manufacturer. The first part you're going to see in here is your spring spacer. We're going to pull that out and just set that to the side for now. Next, we'll go ahead and reach down into the fork and pull out your retaining washer. Make sure you don't lose this, as this is what retains the spacer in place so that it doesn't end up falling into the shock. Next up, we're removing the spring. This is what holds up the main weight of the bike, and it's also what's going to retain our emulator in place. And once again, I have a rag on bottom just to catch the excess oil. So now let's go ahead and get started with installing the actual emulator. First step is going to be taking the emulator and screwing it into the bottom of your spring. This should only be hand tight, so don't use tools here because you will break the emulator. Next up, we're going to go ahead and look at the piston rings. We're going to make sure that the gaps in the piston rings are facing anywhere from 180 to 90 degrees from each other just to have the best possible seal. From here, we're going to use care inserting the emulator into the fork, moving the spring in a circular direction to avoid damaging the piston rings. As it slides down, you should notice a bit of resistance with the oil. If it's not hitting that resistance with the oil, you probably need to add more oil to the system. Next up, we're going to put our retaining washer down on top of our spring. Make sure that is nice and flat, doesn't get stuck, and then we'll be able to put our spring spacer on top and sealing everything with the top cap. Using a bit of pressure on the cap, you'll feel the two rubber O-rings on the emulator seat into the fork. You'll know the emulator is seated correctly when it sticks up about a finger's width above the fork. Next up, using care, we're going to thread the top cap onto the fork. We want to be careful when threading this in and making sure that it's fully aligned. The aluminum top cap will cross thread if not inserted properly. And once you get this top cap to the right torque, that's going to be it for the first side of the fork. We'll go ahead and move on to the other side of the bike, which will repeat the same process, but I'm not going to go over as much detail. But I will still show you guys just so you get a full understanding of how to install the emulators. So we'll reach down into the fork and retrieve the second spring out of the fork. Once again, trying to catch the excess oil with the rag. And now it's time to install the second emulator. Again, we will screw the threaded part into the bottom of our spring. Hand tight should be fine, no tools in this area. And we'll go ahead and notice our spring slides all the way back down in there. There is some resistance at the bottom with oil. Again, if there's not resistance, we want to make sure we add oil to the system because that's what's going to really give us our compressive force. And we'll go ahead and finish up this second fork by putting the top cap back on, making sure that we have it at torque. And the final step of the assembly is going to be moving on to putting the handlebars back on. We want to make sure that they're nice and aligned, not too far to the left or right. As we're putting this top cap on, I like to go in a crisscross pattern, putting left to right on. And just as with the top cap, we want to be careful with the assembly because it is made of aluminum. You don't want to go stripping threads and having to replace parts. So I'll do a final shakedown on the bike to make sure nothing is loose. I'll take a rag and wipe off any excess oil that might have dripped down on the head tubes. But that's going to conclude this installation of the Prime Series Emulator.